Okay, so this is Pyromaniac Mo, welcoming you to another sit down. Today, on the horn, I was able to wrangle up Sigmund Bloom. Sigmund, how are you, sir?
Great. We've the culmination of one season, turn the page to the next season. The fun thing is football obsession doesn't seem so weird now. Caring about the NFL 365 is an actual industry. So I'm enjoying it while it lasts.
As am I, my friend. Um, in case our viewing audience has not heard of you, where can we find you these days?
Yeah.
Twitter and online, and where do we find your good stuff?
Yeah, footballguys.com. The Audible, we do 8 episodes a week during the season. We'll cut that down to maybe two. I'll do on the couch a lot of draft content. You can find the Audible on iTunes. Just search for football guys on iTunes, and Twitter at Sigmund Bloom. So consolidated. I'm monogamous. Football guys now being part owner, and it's what's fun is we're branching out, doing more off-season content, more draft content. Will be free in the off-season, and there's a lot more things to come. I know daily fantasy is really mushrooming, and we've got a ton of things in store for daily fantasy this year. So exciting times.
All right, very cool. Well, Sigmund, let's get down to brass tacks, if we
Mm.
shall.
Mm.
If you were a tree, sir, what kind?
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. That's the Chuck
No.
Wooler. That's the Chuck Woolery file.
All right.
Um,
I'm ready for that too.
speaking of the off season, how do you stay involved? How do you stay plugged into the
Yeah.
NFL and what's going on?
Totally. Well, no, this is the fun part, right? Because there's another season that starts when the Super Bowl's over, and for a lot of teams, it started already. Instead of being about the players, it's about the front offices, it's about the scouts, it's about the coaches. And we have so many different things to study. We have the draft, including just getting to know the players in the draft, coaching changes. We have free agency. We'll start to get some things after the draft. We'll trickle in about OTAs, how players are fitting in. And there's going to be so much turnover, especially from a fantasy football standpoint. There's going to be so much turnover this year. I see anywhere from 12 to 20 backfields that could look entirely different than they did at the end of the season. So having the drop on those things is really important, and just it's fun to monitor. The NFL gives us any given day in the 365-day news cycle. There's something to analyze. There's something to look at, and if there's nothing new, then you can go back and watch film. You can read great things that other people write. So there's no shortage of good analysis and insight on the NFL. And then the more you think about these things, and you have some stance or some lean, then when the frenzy starts in July and August, you don't get moved off of your position as much. When you're coming in cold in July and August, and I think life. When people tell me they don't play fantasy football anymore, I say, well, great, you found better things to do with your life. Coming in cold in July and August is good. You can make it work, but then you got to find the right people who've been tuned in for the entire offseason.
Exactly, and like you say, it's a 365 business nowadays. They are just kings of marketing. There's always something new going on. And, Pyromaniac, we're doing a podcast every week, in season, off season. That helps us stay plugged in. One of the things we were kind of talking about doing more of in the off season and in draft preparation was doing more mock drafts. That's something we want to get into. What's one thing the average fantasy football player can do to keep up with what's going on? Is it mock drafts? Is it a place they can go to plug in?
Right.
What do you think?
Sure. Well, we have a newswire. Roto World has a newswire. Just checking in on those, or your Twitter. Anybody on your Twitter that you've been following during the season that's active enough to stay going in the off season will direct you to things. But you brought up drafts, and what's neat are these best ball drafts, like MFL 10. My fantasy league does them. I'm sure that they're going to grow in popularity and number of outlets. And doing that draft, I mean, the stakes aren't really as important as getting your juices flowing, and you start to see picks that just stand out to you. Like, wow, last year it was Manuel Sanders. Wow, Manuel Sanders is still there in the 7th or 8th round. And you can start to formulate your strategy and understand what the cornerstones of your strategy are going to be. Some picks you can reserve or write in pen, or at least in pencil, because you can have done enough drafts to know that, but also just the simulation of seeing the way the picks can come off the board in certain ways. Almost the best thing that can happen in these mock drafts if you do them. And I'm not going to say mock because if you're putting $10 up, it's only $10. But there is something to be said for there to be some stake, even the smallest stake. It makes people draft a little bit more true to their convictions than in a mock draft. The best thing that can happen is getting caught totally off guard and having to get off of your plan A and your plan B. That's the kind of stuff that can help you win in a league where other people are going to be floundering.
Yeah, we've all been there in draft rooms when you get flustered. That's why we were talking about having multiple opportunities to get flustered before it starts, and then you kind of, I don't know, you center yourself, you get your zen going, and you can regroup, and then it doesn't have as big of a whammy effect on you.
And it intimidates your opponents too. When you look like cool as a cucumber, like 7 running backs just went off the board and nobody was ready for that, and you just looking at your sheet and you're like waiting for your pick. That gets in the head of your opponent sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Staying calm, staying cool. We all like to have a few Valverdes, as we will call it, or
Absolutely.
a few drinks. But staying calm and cool in the draft is a huge thing. Especially you got guys in from out of town. You got some buddies you haven't seen in a long time. So it can be tough to remain reserved. You talked about the daily leagues, FanDuel, and all these things that are out there. Do you have any strategies as far as FanDuel? Do you like to select certain players? Where do you spend the money?
In the week 16 this year, I just finally had enough time in my schedule free to really dig in. I didn't really write or do much daily because my weekly schedule during the season is 70 hours and there's just not much give for anything else. I did do daily fantasy way back in the aughts, early aughts, before it was something that was lightning quick account management. Prizes were sports memorabilia and things like that. People remember a site called Sandbox and other sites out there that did this. It was more for fun and amusement. But I think what we've zeroed in on is finding 1 or 2 low-cost options that you're comfortable with. It doesn't really matter the position, although quarterback is one of the easiest positions to get away with it. Running back, when there's injuries and the price fluctuations haven't caught up yet, that's one of the easiest positions to get away with it. And then zeroing in on the studs, zeroing in on the players that you can set your watch by, that you have the highest confidence level in for that week, and picking the right ones. I mean, picking the guys that are ready to have that 11-catch, 150-yard game instead of 7 catches, 90 yards. So that's how I like to build my lineups, and I like to do just tournaments. It's more for the thrill and amusement than to try to grind a bankroll and build it for me. So I think you start at either end of that, but I think it's easiest to start with the cheapo players that you feel like have the best chance of coming through, and then work with the studs, because I think that's the same kind of decision every week, unless you have something like Odell Beckham who gets on a run and you just don't bench him any week for any reason.
Right. Yeah. ODB, answer to a lot of prayers. In the FanDuel daily leagues, like I was looking for a lot of my cheap players, like on a week when Julio Jones is out, and then Harry Douglas steps up, or when Moncrief would step up when Reggie would be out, or someone that when they made the lineups, they started them off cheap, and then there was an injury or whatever. That's kind of where I would look to, I don't know, gain some ground. Anything else you can point to that helped you in the season?
Well, I think from a daily standpoint, you're right that watching the price changes and then tracking whether developments during the week made them obsolete really that quickly. And then it takes you to another fork in the road where you have to choose, am I going to have the player that is 60-70% owned and then have to get my variance elsewhere, or am I going to fade this player? As far as other tips, honestly, there's always these things like scenarios. I think stacking players really embraces this, that maybe the bright starting point, and we're gonna come at this, and there's so many people on Football Guy staff that are so much better at this than I am. I'm an amateur at this point, but people like Moral Tremblay and David Dodds and John Lee and so on. There's been a lot of things in store. We're gonna cover this, but one of the angles I think you can attack this from as a starting point before you even get into any individual players or prices or anything like that is looking at the games and envisioning on that spectrum of game scripts, what do you think likely? We do this really well in the playoffs because there's only a few games to meditate on, but we don't do it as much. The season moves faster. There's more on our plate during the season, but really taking a chance, taking some time out, and just thinking, how do I think this game is going to go? Which of these teams has the bigger advantages, and they have the wherewithal, coaching, and so on to exploit these advantages, and trying to find a few games that you can zero in on and feel comfortable that even though people think this is a 50-50 proposition, I feel really confident that this team's going to dominate, and here's why, and then putting those beliefs in action. So I think having strong convictions about how few games are going to go on a 13, 14, 15, 16 game slate can make your decisions a lot easier.
Going back, sorry, my office building's talking here. Going back to the redraft, the leagues we all know and love, and it's always like that four-legged table, right? You've got all these different parts that you're shooting for, and I think the first one, you've got your lineup changes, yeah, you've got your draft. Draft is certainly the biggest one, and then you get into trading, you get into all these different aspects. But going into the draft, are you changing anything this year from what you've learned? Are you going to go running back early and often? Do you do the opposite strategy? Are you looking to hold on quarterback? Anything you can take away from that you're going to apply to your draft in the next coming year?
Incrementally, I think that we see that it's you have to get one running back. You have to get your anchor running back. I think you can play fast and loose with your running back 2 slot. So whether it's first round or maybe second round, if Adrian Peterson's consistently falling to the second round and you say, I'm fine with him as my running back 1 because he's on a new team or whatever, you want to reserve one of those picks for a running back you have a high level of confidence in. One of those first 2 picks, maybe third round, but man, the third round was brutal for running backs this year. Quarterback, we can take it to E. I mean, you can wait until the 15th round. You can basically take a quarterback based on the week 1 matchup at this point. You can stream quarterbacks because you're not going to have that much competition. Everyone's going to love their quarterback. There's more than 12 good ones. It's someone like Eli Manning. Speaking of Odell Beckham, he could be easily a top 10 quarterback next year. He probably won't go in the top 12 in any draft. Wide receivers maybe will be a little more open this year to younger wide receivers hitting the ground running after what happened, although this class won't compare to that class. There's some talented guys. But here's something that I might try this year as a larger draft strategy question. You mentioned the 4 legs of the table. Matt Waldman, one of my colleagues, has done a really good job explaining how the other parts of the legs, the trades, the waiver wire moves, the lineup setting, is really just as important. When we look back, like when you win a fantasy football championship, look at your lineup. How many of those players are players that you drafted? Usually, 2, 3, maybe 4. And it's other things during the season that determine that just as much as the draft. But as you said, the draft's the biggest part because it's the one we have the most time to look at. And we come up with all these nifty draft strategies, like make sure you take this position around this round and wait for this. But as I'm fond of saying, every draft strategy works if you pick the right players. So what I'm going to try this year, I'm really going to try to do it, is go with a true best player available strategy. And that means if the best player available is a tight end in the 3rd round and in the 4th round and in the 5th round, then I'll take 3 tight ends in a row. I don't care. I don't even care if there's not a flex because it's much more important to hit on the pick than it is to cross off a need on your list because other facets of your game can fill in gaps, and the important thing is to take players that you believe in. So I'm going to really try that and see how that goes and see what the results are, see if it makes me have some absurd surpluses of quarterbacks I can never trade or something like that, or if it works out.
I like that because, as you say, you got the 4 legs, you got the draft, waiver wire, trading, setting the lineups. So if you've got a monopoly on tight end guys, you just got more strength for another leg of your table. You've got more to trade, more to offer, and then you might be able to sort of capitalize on the market, really. What about that another leg of the table, waiver wires? We saw some huge waiver wire pickups. ODB, C.J. Anderson, Agiata, heck, Forsett. We saw some huge guys coming off the waiver wires. I'm I'm always kind of guilty of going with the latest and greatest. This guy's on the waiver, he's available, and then I get too many guys. How do you know when to spend the money and how much if you're dealing with a fab budget? Are you going to
Yeah.
find the most magic early in the season? Is it later in the season? How do you view waiver wire, and how do you win the waiver wire war?
Well, if you get one or two players who really help you on the waiver wire, you won. So keeping that in mind, I do think that, for instance, people who pushed 90 or 95% of their budget on Josh Gordon, even though he didn't work out in the end, that idea, being willing to, if you have that clarity, and just saying, I'm going, especially early in the season. Now, obviously, Gordon doesn't really fit this example because he didn't come back until week 12, but the earlier you pick a player up in the season, Justin Forsett, for example, the longer he's going to help you. He's going to potentially have more value for you because you'll have him for all those weeks. So I think there's an incentive to fire some bullets early. But remember, the bids that were winning Forsett in week 1 last year were like 30, 40%, not 80, 90%. So I think that you can do a modified approach. I do think you want to take some stabs early because also another thing is in those first few weeks there's such a scramble that players can be under the radar. And maybe if a player hasn't done anything within a week, you might be able to pick them up the next week. So it's making sure you're trawling the waiver wire for players that are dropped prematurely is also important, and to have a few bullets left for the end of the season, even just for preemptive pickups, keeping somebody on your bench instead of on your opponent's bench. So I think you want to modify it. I think you do take 2 or 3 shots of the 20 to 30% range during the season, but you also want to leave some bullets in the end. We do something every week at Football Guys. I break down suggested ranges. You know your league better than I do of what it takes to win players, but I think you have to know when to be aggressive, but you also have to give yourself a lot of swings at the pinata.
Yeah, that's the thing. This year, I was taking too many swings, and I just wasn't patient enough. I would fall in love with these guys, and I'd bid on them, and then I'd drop them before I'd give them too much of a chance. I'm always, looking at RB2 spot. Mine was just this turnstile of dudes coming in and out. So, in a perfect world, what are you spending? 25%, 30% max, and you've got maybe 2, 3 pickups during the year with a possible bullet left in the chamber, kind of maybe 4 or 5 in a perfect world. What's the range?
Yeah, well, I think that you want to have 2 or 3 points where it's a very high confidence move, but otherwise, when having a lot of ones where you can peel off just one unit, if it's 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 200 or what have you, just for some pickups. And we like to highlight these where maybe you try to be a week or two early, like we were talking about Odell Beckham. Yeah, 2 or 3 weeks before he was due to come back because you want to be a week ahead. And then knowledge is getting spread out much more equally now, so you do need to be more aggressive. You do need to anticipate more. But I think that another thing, if we're going to take some lessons out of 2014, is following those situations. And one of the worst picks you could have made in the first round last year was Monty Ball. I was not a Monty Ball guy. I was always a C.J. Anderson guy, but as you said about patience, I dropped C.J. Anderson in a few leagues. It hurt. It really hurt. I dropped him, I think, when it was Monty Ball was about to come back. Ronnie Hillman was running well. C.J. Anderson was just a week or two off of being a healthy scratch, and they weren't showing any signs of using him. And then, of course, injuries parted the Red Sea for him, and he did the rest. The point is that if you had drafted Monty Ball and just stuck with the situation, because why would you have taken Monty Ball in the first round? Not because Monty Ball is a great running back. He's not. Because you love the Denver situation. And if you just use your waiver wire moves to keep cornering the market on a situation. So I'm going to draft Monty Ball, but then I'm going to make sure I have Hillman, and I'm going to make sure I have Anderson. Handcuffing or retroact or handcuffing after the fact when a guy goes down is important. So I think that you ideally want to always leave like 10 or 20 or 30% of your budget for things like that. And with a guy like Josh Gordon rarely ends up on the waiver wire. That's one of the few exceptions. Although, like I said, I advocate that if something like that happens again too.
So, speaking of Monty Ball, we had this conversation on a podcast not too long ago, and as you said, it's the situation there in Denver. That's what you were really drafting for, and it took them a long time before, Hillman, they go through Monty Ball before they got to C.J. Anderson. What's your take on him? I really like what I saw in the Indy game when they lost. He ran some hard plays, some third downs that he got on sheer force of will alone. he impressed me. Whereas some other guys, they don't like what they see. What do you think of C.J.
Yeah.
Anderson?
I
Why did it take them so long to find him?
there were some things maybe he wasn't in the best shape in the off season. Um, yeah, otherwise, confidence, I guess. I think that we do see something in football and something we have to be aware of in fantasy football, wary of, is a coaching staff that is trying hard to prove that their personnel decisions were correct. Anderson was undrafted. Ball was a second round pick, so the second round pick's always going to get more opportunities. But I think what you point to, his performance in the playoffs, and really remember it was Monty Ball's long catch and run on a screen pass against Oakland when they were really Denver was dragging against Oakland, and he busted off this long catch and run and really turned the season around. And then, of course, no coincidence, as Peyton Manning was hurt, they were relying on Anderson, and he was coming through. So the bottom line is this: going into next year, you should just treat C.J. Anderson as the man. And now that you have Gary Kubiak, and we saw what Kubiak did for Justin Forsett, who we brought up already on the show, that should make you extra excited about Anderson. So where Monty Ball was a pick, I think that was too eager on situation. If you're taking C.J. Anderson amongst the group just after your Forte, Le'Veon Bell, Jamal Charles types, if you're debating between C.J. Anderson and LaShawn McCoy, then I think you're on the right track.
You bring up an interesting one with Kubiak there. And maybe there's some other coaching changes you want to talk about, but do you like
Yeah.
Kubiak's role? What he did a hell of a job with Flacco and his supporting staff. Do you think he's going to have a positive effect out in Denver?
It seems, especially and add Wade Phillips in on the defensive side. What's going to be interesting is if Peyton Manning comes back, and I would guess he's going to come back. How this looks like more like a Gary Kubiak team than a Peyton Manning team. Because has there ever been a team with Peyton Manning on it that didn't look like a Peyton Manning team? Like the Tony Dungy Colts and now these Broncos, they really are. It's funny because when people say, "Oh, it's all about him," like that's Peyton Manning in a nutshell. And Gary Kubiak, and I think John Elway even more than Kubiak, although it's not a coincidence that Kubiak was Elway's longtime backup, are saying, no, it's our team now. You're a player on our team. It's not your team. And I think that Peyton Manning could really make the offense click as a balanced offense, as more of a game manager. I know that sounds like a bad word. So, yeah, I'm very excited about that. There's a lot of things that are interesting. I think that we can't overlook the little nugget that Bill Musgrave, the new offensive coordinator in Oakland, said that the one thing he's going to bring with him from Philly is the hurry-up offense, the no-huddle offense. And if they really go to that as a base philosophy, and Derek Carr did show the wherewithal to handle that kind of offense, now Latavius Murray becomes much more interesting. Whatever wide receiver they draft or sign becomes more interesting. Or maybe Marshawn Lynch becomes more interesting. Maybe Marshawn Lynch is there in Oakland. The point is that's the kind of thing that I hear that fascinates me. You brought up in the notes that you sent about Mark Trestman in Baltimore, and you mentioned how Gary Kubiak did in Baltimore. And we also have to go back to Jim Caldwell and how Joe Flacco took very quickly. Remember, they fired Cam Cameron in like week 15 that year or week 13, and he took very quickly to what Jim Caldwell was serving. So Trestman and the possibility that he is truly a quarterback whisperer, and it was just Jay Cutler, makes him more even than him the Baltimore offense, pass offense, fascinating. There's a lot to absorb here. We've got to look at what Atlanta's going to do, what Chicago's going to do with Adam Gase, and what San Francisco can do now. That it looks like they're sticking with Colin Kaepernick. That's what's beautiful, man. Mo, we could just talk about coaching changes and easily take up an hour and really just touch on setting the story, not even getting into what we thought about it. And this is just one aspect of one thing that we're going to look at in the offseason.
Well, there's guys moving around all the time in this league, but give me a coach or two where maybe even just one where you feel his offense is going to have an immediate impact on fantasy, where you might have, I don't know, Flacco, he had a great year under Kubiak, but maybe now with Trestman there, the quarterback whisperer, is he going to bring in the offense, and is that going to have an immediate impact on Flacco? What coach are we going to see in the fantasy world bring the most impact to?
I'll go back to Musgrave potentially. simply because of the idea of running that Philadelphia style offense with Derek Carr. It can make Derek Carr interesting. Remember, Derek Carr is a pretty athletic guy and can make, and what that volume in an offense does is it makes more mediocre talents very productive. Look what it did for Jeremy Maclin. Very, very productive. I'll bring up another one really quickly as a more obscure name is Dwell Logains. Might remember him. I think he was Tennessee's offensive coordinator for a while. He really likes Jay Cutler. He stumps for Cutler. I think that Cutler was trying to get him into Chicago before Logains took that role in Tennessee. So here's another one where Chicago and San Francisco are these organizations that have crossroads, at a fork in the road with their quarterbacks. And in both cases, it appears they chose the quarterback as opposed to bringing in new people and saying, well, do you like Kaepernick? Do you not like Kaepernick? Do you like Cutler? Do you not like Cutler? We want to let you do what you want to do. It appears that no, the people at the top of the organization want to go forward with these quarterbacks because in San Fran's case, it's Jeep Christ who was he was the quarterback coach for Kaepernick for his first 4 years of his career. So basically, this is the only quarterback coach Kaepernick has ever known. Now he's his offensive coordinator. So it'll be interesting to see with Cutler and Kaepernick whether the organization's basically giving them a big vote of confidence and making coaching hires, I believe. And Adam Gase also did. Think of what Adam Gase did for Peyton Manning. I mean, he broke the record under Adam Gase's leadership. Well, again, going back to Peyton Manning, that's another can of worms of who's really the offensive coordinator. But regardless, Gase was in the room. He was in the room. His name was on the program. So that's exciting. So Chicago and San Francisco are offenses that lost their way during this season. If the quarterbacks can actually return to form, then maybe they can get it going again.
So we talked about some coaches that might have impact fantasy-wise. What about guys situationally that might make a leap in production? So, I don't know if Seattle's going to be able to get rid of Lynch now, but let's say Lynch goes, maybe Christine Michael's going to have a big step up. Maybe Welker, his role is reduced or he's pushed aside. Either way, Sanders makes that switch, and now you got Cody Latimer making a big jump in production. Any guys you're keeping an eye on, like Christine Michael or like a Cody Latimer?
Sure. And I don't even know where to draw the line here because there's so many players that either directly by their free agency or their choices or by how those other players on the move could affect them. But we're going to have I think we're going to have something like a running back merry-go-round this year between free agents and the draft. So Adrian Peterson might be on the market. DeMarco Murray is a free agent, and Dallas hasn't been moving that strong to get him. But also in Justin Forsett, we can wonder what's going to happen with him. But also guys like Mark Ingram and Ryan Matthews and Stephen Ridley, running backs that are still very competent running backs. No Sean Moreno, Ray Rice. Let's not forget about Ray Rice. You have all these guys that could be affecting the running back situations. And then the draft. This is going to be an excellent running back class. Probably, I just did a show with Josh Norris from Roto World this morning on the couch, and he said 8. He said he's potentially 8 instant impact running backs. And he said he would rank his number 1 running back from last year's draft 9th in this year's draft. So it's not a prodigious class on the level of last year's wide receiver class, but as far as the difference between last year's class and this year's class and the ability of the rookies to make an instant impact, it's going to feel like that. So I think we may see, as I said, as many as half or more of the backfields go through a lot of changes. I think this Justin Blackmon situation is one to watch now, under the radar kind of when the Josh Gordon stuff was going on earlier this week. Alex Marvez from Fox Sports just put out there casually. But on the flip side, Jacksonville is optimistic that Justin Blackmon can return. That could change things there. And then Philadelphia, and where do you even start? I mean, LeSean McCoy and his contract, Nick Foles, will he be even in Philadelphia? Will they take Marcus Mariota? What's going to happen with the wide receivers? Jordan Matthews, does Jeremy Maclin come back? If he doesn't come back, do they sign somebody else? Do they put Josh Huff in there? Every aspect. Philadelphia's offense is so potent that we have to put every aspect of it every offseason at the top of our to-do list.
Last one, sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum. Is there any guy you're putting the swine flu label on? do not touch no matter what. I mean, is Fred Jackson, he oldest dude out there for running backs, is
Yeah.
he finally fallen off the cliff? Is there anyone else? I mean, DeMarco Murray for that point. Has he been overused? Did career year beware? Is there anyone you're really staying away from?
I need to reference something here because I have been doing an early draft, a 16-team Survivor League draft though. But the nice thing is you get some early looks at ADP. You get some early looks at how other people are valuing players. I'd say looking at it early on, Julius Thomas is a player I'd be very wary of. First of all, whether he'll be back in Denver to begin with. If he isn't in Denver, that could take all the wind out of his sails. And even if he is in Denver, we saw how much better the offense did. He was banged up, but we saw how much better the offense did when he wasn't there. Um, I would be wary. I mean, at this point, before we know what's going to happen, I'd be wary of Jeremy Maclin. I think he's another player that elsewhere is not going to put up nearly the numbers he did. It was more the Philadelphia system. I think even Jordan Matthews, people were getting a little ahead of themselves on. I think he's going to remain a slot receiver. I think you're going to see somebody else take more of the outside snaps. The Phillies has his game pegged. He's a Marcus Colston type receiver. So one of the big elements here is going to be free agency, and you're going to see massive value swings. In another player, even, and I like this player a lot, but another player I think that we've gotten a little bit ahead of ourselves on is Isaiah Crowell, only because of this. I don't know how the Cleveland running game is going to look without Kyle Shanahan, and for that matter, since we're scatting and jiving and hopping around here, Kyle Shanahan's going to be in Atlanta. Devontae Freeman becomes a very interesting guy because it's the system. I mean, look at what Kyle Shanahan's system did for the Cleveland running game last year. Obviously, they don't have the same level offensive line, but they have a really good quarterback and a couple of good receivers there. So it's as you can tell as I go on and on, Mo.
I dig
It's
it,
much
man.
it's much easier to say what we do. Like we could do a much shorter list if we said what do we know for sure is not going to change. That's a short list. What we're going to be watching for changes, that's a really long list.
We had, as you say, we're getting the jazz out here, so we're just letting it rip. But on our Pyro website, I was putting up my last interview with Matt Harrison, and I said that I would be interviewing you, and we had a listener that referred to you as the IDP guru.
Hmm.
I like that title. I'd like it even more if you just, moved to the top of a mountain and we had to climb up
Right.
and ask you advice and leave you gifts and that kind of thing. But going forward with IDP, we don't get into that too much. Talk about some IDP for us. Give us some names that
Sure.
you're looking at, some teams maybe even that holds a lot of value.
Well, other than getting in, I won't get into that many specifics, and I won't pretend that I'm truly an IDP guru. Although I love playing IDP fantasy football, and I've done pretty well in my leagues. I do a show every week with Gene Bramall and John Norton, who really are the brain trust of the IDP side. And I think what we're always looking for are those second tier linebackers that come on. Obviously, some of the things are fixed at the top of our board, like J.J. Watt. We'll look for bounce back players like Robert Quinn this year. But more than that, I want to say, use this as an opportunity to make a pitch for IDP fantasy football. First of all, as I was said about the draft, like if you're using the time during the spring to become familiar with the rookies, then when they start to do things, it just means more. You have context, you have an origin story. Likewise, if you play IDP fantasy football, it gets you to dig in on the defensive side of the ball. And circling this back around to daily fantasy, Mo, what is daily fantasy? What's the essence of it? But matchups. And if you know which teams have the best pass rushers, if you know which teams have the shutdown corners, if you understand which teams take away the middle of the field or which teams give up the most lapses. For instance, one of the things in IDP fantasy football that can work out well for you, is if you take players that are cornerbacks that are inexperienced that are going to get targeted a lot because that gives them a lot of opportunities for tackles, for passes defended, for interceptions. On the flip side of that, from a daily fantasy perspective, if you know that a secondary has a player with a target on his back and you can understand based on how they line up on the right or the left, whether they shuffle their cornerbacks and which wide receivers line up in that spot, now you can start to have an edge and say, well, there's a good chance that this receiver who doesn't normally get targeted that much will get targeted a lot more this week because of the matchup. So all the pieces fit together, and daily fantasy puts you on the spot, and if you go in knowing nothing about defense, then I think that it's like tying one hand behind your back.
Last question for you, Sigmund. And I don't play IDP, but I've been kind of thinking about it. I'm always looking for ways to, I don't know, shake up the league. I got a league I've been doing with my buddies for ages and ages, my high school buddies. But we're always looking for new stuff to do. So maybe an IDP could be something, or two quarterback leagues,
Yeah.
starting a rookie, empire leagues. You got any cool ideas to keep things fresh, to keep players interested?
Yeah.
Different ideas for leagues?
Two quarterback leagues, I think, or at least a flex where you can maybe two flexes and one of them can be a quarterback. A super flex league, I think, is very much keeping up with the times, because most people this year more and more people are going to wait on quarterback, which it's not. There's such a surplus when you only start 12 of viable quarterbacks that there's no disincentive. Even if, as long as you have the waiver wire before week 1, you could even not draft a quarterback now, like you wouldn't draft a kicker or a defense. So I think that's important. I like salary cap contract leagues because it simulates more of the GM side, where you sign players to contracts. Maybe you have an auction. That's the starting price of the contract. Price goes up a certain number. Maybe the longer term the contract, the price goes up less gradually, and you get a bit of a discount, but you have to make more of a commitment. Then when you cut players before the contract's over, you take cap hits. It really gets you more into the GM mode, and it has you trades become more interesting, because draft picks may have, well, the number 6 pick in the first round is now a player that you can lock in at $15 a year for 3 years or something like that. So it adds another dimension to strategy. You have to know your league. If they're looking for more strategy, you mentioned IDPs. One of the things I want to say to anyone out there thinking about adding IDPs, you have to do at least 2 at every level of the defense. If you do one defensive lineman, one linebacker, one defensive back, it's basically like kickers. There's enough around that are going to score the same that it just becomes a crapshoot. And I think one of the other things that people might be starting to look into now are combining the two, right? Like marrying season-long football and daily, where you could have a league where maybe it's a total points league, and a league where you have some sort of stake every week and a stake for the end of the season, that you play against each other in a daily format, and then you tabulate your totals week over week, so you have that longer investment, maybe some bigger prize at the end of the season. So what's neat, I don't think it's an either-or proposition. I think daily fantasy and season-long fantasy are both wonderful for different reasons, and we're going to continue to find ways to marry the two.
Excellent. And Dynasty as well. I said that was my last question, but do have one more. We got Duron Carter in the news. Any other guys, Dynasty-wise, that you might be looking at? I mean, what do you think of this kid, or is there anyone else out there for Dynasty?
Oh, geez. I mean, this is another one. We just did a show in early January where we broke down the end of the roster stashes. This guy's getting future reserve contracts from the practice squads, and one of them I'll just bring up right now. We've already brought up DeMarco Murray, is Ryan Williams, and Dallas loves him. They kept him on the practice squad last year. He issued chances to play for other teams, instead wanted to play with Dallas. Dallas has indicated they may be ready to move on. Now, I think it makes sense that they would make a play for someone like Adrian Peterson. Maybe draft somebody like Todd Gurley or Melvin Gordon, or there's so many good running backs later on. But they gave Ryan Williams a $240,000 signing bonus, which is more along the lines of in rookie picks, like what a 4th rounder or 5th rounder would get. He's got a salary of $750,000 a year this year, next year, which is more than the minimum. So there's some, let me put it this way, money talks, and there's some sign there that they have hopes for him. And he was on their practice squad. A lot of players got called up from the practice squad to future reserve contracts, players with significant talent who maybe need more development. So we're going to be watching those players. But Ryan Williams could easily be going into the 2015 season as the starting running back for the Dallas Cowboys, even though he didn't spend a day on their roster last year.
I like it. He's a good kid. He's lots of talent. Looked great in college.
Yeah. Yep.
Just hasn't been able to stay healthy. Sigmund, I really appreciate it, sir. Again, Sigmund Bloom at Sigmund Bloom on Twitter. Again, football guys, and I've been a big fan of On the Couch, so it was kind of nice to flip the script on you a little bit,
Yeah.
and I really appreciate your time.
My great pleasure, and to everybody out there, I love it. When people reach out, I love being able to say yes. I enjoy talking about football, so this is fantastic for me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Can't thank you enough, sir. Once again, this is Pyromaniac Mo signing off, and we will chat again with you soon.